Hi everybody, it's Chris Francese from Dickinson College Commentaries, back with another in a short series of videos about how to write notes for our series of commentaries on classical texts. In the first one, I laid out 10 principles for writing notes, annotations, and here I just want to look at some examples of how those might work out in a particular context. Just to review, the principles that are obviously sort of rules of thumb, guidelines rather than Mosaic law, is that we want to try and model close reading practices in general. This is sort of an umbrella principle that encompasses a lot of the others. The second is to respect the reader's time and be concise as possible, short as possible, but no shorter. Thirdly, separate interpretation from elucidation, distinguish making interpretive argument from actually explaining what's going on in a particular passage. Fourth, translate idiomatically, or at least help the reader when the text makes no sense translated literally. Fifth, elucidate first, observe second. And we'll look at some examples of that. Six, look out for what's assumed. These are rich texts that leave a lot to the reader's background knowledge. And seven, look at what is typical or atypical. In other words, to help the reader either perceive something as unusual or to know that it's something important that they should look out for next time. Save space by linking to stable resources. We'll look at some examples later. Go easy on cross-references. Everything in moderation. And then 10, use jargon for a reason, also sort of in moderation, and hopefully explaining it so things don't depend on the reader knowing a particular term to get what's going on. All right, so for an example, let's check out Ovid Amores, Book 1, Poem 2, and this is a delightful passage where Ovid confesses himself to be in love and hands himself over to Cupid as a captive, and he imagines himself being led in triumph by Cupid. So this is the triumph of Cupid. He says, Necte comam murto, maternas junge columbas, qui deceat currum vitricus ipse dabit. Inque dato curru, populo clamante triumphum stabis, et adjunctas arte movevis aves. Ducentur capti juvenes, captaeque puellae, haec tibi magnificus pompa triumphus erit. All right, we'll look at 4 examples of commentaries on this passage. The first one is from 1902, published in Hungary, and it's very concise and particularly strong at bringing out what is assumed. In this case, in this particular first note, the fact that myrtle is a substitute for laurel, which is the normal thing for Roman triumphing generals to have. He follows this up with what I view as somewhat tangential information and would want to cut out for concision. And it's actually something that Ovid is specifically relying on you not thinking about in this particular passage. So it's interesting, but not essential. Here, this is an example of elucidating by paraphrase. You don't have to always have a translation, but he sort of rewrites the Latin a little bit to make it a little bit clearer. And at this note, Nemethy makes it clear what's typical. Usually Venus's chariot is drawn by doves or swans, and with some apposite parallels from Sappho and Horace. And here's a series of notes that just makes clear what's assumed, those allusions the reader is supposed to get. All right, so far so good. So that's a very nice, concise example. Probably not enough cultural background for a contemporary reader. I guess in 1902 they could assume more familiarity with the Roman triumph. And there's not much in the way of kind of appreciation of the art of the language at all. John Barsby writes a commentary in 1973, which is much stronger on that sort of interpretive task of modeling close reading practices, and he points out right away that the ingenuity is what's so delicious about this passage. In the course of a very nice interpretive paraphrase, he fills in some of this background knowledge that you might want the reader to have, and in what I think is just an excellent example of close reading practices, he notes that there are two possible senses of the word captus that may be active in this passage, something a novice reader might well miss. There's some cross references, apposite, backing up what he's saying, limited, which is terrific. He points out something that's unusual in this case, that the antecedent of a relative pronoun follows the relative pronoun itself, something that a novice reader might miss. He does use a mere label to explain dekeat, which is kind of a shame. Doesn't help you much if you don't know what a consecutive subjunctive is. So these grammatical notes are much shorter than what we typically want for DCC, but that close reading essay is just right up our alley, in the sense it would work very nicely as one of our close reading essays. All right, more recent commentary. Maureen Ryan and Caroline Perkins has a somewhat fuller line-by-line commentary on Book 1 of the Amores, and there's a lot of overlap, as there will be, with explicating assumed information that is just not very controversial. On this passage, Ryan and Perkins helpfully point out the fact that pronouns are omitted often in poetry. Kind of basic information, but that's certainly helpful for a novice reader and something to look out for in the future. They also point out what's typical in where Ovid might be somewhat innovating. It's unclear exactly who the Vitricus is in this passage. Could be Vulcan, could be Mars, and they take the point of view that it's Vulcan and say it's usually would be Mars. This is a very concise, nice description of what a Roman triumph is, assuming no prior knowledge. I think that's very good. Would be very not out of place at all in DCC. In this half of the note, however, they make what I view as an inadequately articulated interpretive argument about official poetry versus unofficial poetry, and it's they're citing some the classic article of Galinsky on this, but it's just not spelled out well, and I would remove that to an essay or just omit it. Here's a terrific example of an idiomatic translation used when the text doesn't make sense literally. That'd be great. In this note, they don't elucidate first. They rather give an untranslated parallel passage, a CF note, which is frustrating if you're going to it looking for elucidation of the language. This is followed by a little bit of somewhat unclear use of jargon, if that might be explained more fully. And the whole thing is really another inadequately made interpretive argument that it just doesn't really belong in a note that's trying to elucidate the language. So I would remove that completely, or put it in an essay where there's more time. All right, last one is going to be William Turpin's commentary on this passage from DCC itself, and you'll see that it shares a lot with these other commentaries, spelling out what's assumed, same stuff. Here we can link to our version of Allen and Greenough. So linking to stable resources is obviously an advantage of the digital medium. So we want to do that whenever we can. Supplying what's assumed here. This commentary gives both options, Mars or Vulcan. Here's a nice paraphrase that elucidates. You don't have to use translation every time. Paraphrase can be more informative. And in the digital medium, we can use images to clarify, and on the site there's a picture of an actual myrtle bush, so you can see what that looks like. Here's a grammatical note that's supplemented with a nice stable link to Allen and Greeno. And here is a note that uses paraphrase to clarify first and then goes on to make another point. And that's the sequence that we'd like to see. In that further comment, he points out something, what's typical, that molio is an unusual word to use in this context, that has a tone, and he spells out what that tone, how he thinks that tone sounds very nicely. He also uses an image to clarify what the Roman reader might have been seen in their minds by using the archetypus, which is an image that we have on the site. Here again, with a longer note, clarifies the language first and then moves on to a different discussion, here using an image to illustrate. All right, in Turpin's close reading essay, very much in the tradition of Barsby, but with some different priorities. He discusses the background of slavery, very nicely uses inline citations to send you back to the text that he's commenting on. He deals with the tone, with the literary effect, points out how funny this is, and generally does a great job of letting you in on what a really experienced and sensitive reader can get out of this terrific passage. All right, so I hope that was helpful to illustrate some of these principles, which are obviously not that controversial. Everyone's been doing it for a long time. The next video in this series will be about the details of typography and file management and usage guidelines and style and linking, and sort of the nitty-gritty of how to write notes in the DCC style. But I hope this one was helpful in just illustrating some of the general principles of writing notes for the series. All right, thanks a lot for your attention, and do leave us a comment, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.